Hi, this is Professor Stugard, and in this video, we're going to start discussing, well, what is statistics? And we're going to start by talking about what variables are and how we collect data. Now, first of all, let's talk about kind of this somewhat standard definition for what statistics actually is. And so our definition for statistics is that it is the science and art of collecting, organizing, summarizing, and analyzing data to be able to draw conclusions and to answer questions. Now, the first thing I want to bring your attention to is that statistics is the science. And although statistics is typically taught by mathematics professors and is part of the mathematics department, or, some larger universities have their own statistics departments, typically we think of statistics as a math class, but in reality, it is a science class more than anything else. And it is the science of how we basically try to work with data. Now, that is going to involve some numbers and it is going to involve some mathematics, but it is much more of a science class than a mathematics class. And so what that also means is that just like a science class, we're going to have to start by learning a bunch of definitions and understanding vocabulary, more so that we would in a science class than necessarily a math class. Now, the second part of statistics is it's also a little bit of an art, meaning that we can actually have the same set of data and come to different conclusions. Just like art is open to interpretation, data can also be open to interpretation, and it's important to keep that in the back of our minds too as we study. Now, like I said, it's kind of a science class, but it really is the science class of data. And so there are several parts to be able to, there are several parts that we want to be able to do to successfully do statistics. And again, that's being able to, first of all, collect data, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, organizing data, which we'll talk about another day, as well as summarizing that data, and then finally, our end goal is going to be to analyze that data so that I can draw conclusions and answer questions. Now, what we want to remember, especially as we focus on this data collection, is that it's typically going to be impossible to collect all of the data. It's difficult to ask every single person a question, and it's even more difficult to get them to respond. So when we do statistics, we have to rely on just a small portion of the actual data to make our conclusions. And we see this all the time. We see all of these statistics thrown at us. 70% of Americans think that taxes are too high. Well, how do we know it's 70%? Did they ask you? They didn't ask me. How did they come up with that number if they didn't ask everybody? And that is the heart of statistics. That is going to be our goal by the end of learning statistics, is how we can actually do that, how we can take just some small subgroup and somehow understand the entire group based on that one small little group. Well, that's because there's three parts now to understanding statistics. The first part is simply called descriptive statistics, and it's how we basically describe data or summarize our data. And we can do this with graphs, we can do this with numerical summaries, like talking about maybe the mean or the median or the standard deviation. But basically, how do we just describe data? And that's where we're going to start. But then again, we have to introduce this concept of probability, which is how we determine the likelihood of events. Because again, if I'm only relying on a small subgroup and not the entire group, there has to be some uncertainty in my results. And that's the final step of doing statistics. And it's what we call inferential statistics. It's how we make conclusions about our data, but we have to include the fact that there is going to be some uncertainty in our results. And so, again, this can be very different from a typical math class, whereas in a math class, when we solve an algebra problem, there's one right answer, x equals 2. But when we do inferential statistics, we actually recognize that there might be different answers, and we have got to bake in that whole concept of, there's definitely some uncertainty, or I only have a certain amount of confidence in my data that I've collected. So we need to start with our definitions. This is a science class, so we need to start with definitions now that we're kind of exploring what this idea of statistics really means. And we're going to start with the groups that we are collecting our data from and about. So first of all, population. When we say population, that represents the entire group that we want information about. So again, maybe I want to know how Americans feel about taxes. I want to know how all Americans feel. All Americans would be my population. However, I can't ask everybody, so I'm going to have to rely on a sample. And the sample is our smaller subset of that population that we're collecting our data from. This is the group that I'm actually asking. And then the individual would be the single person at a time that I'm actually asking these questions to, right? I'm asking one person at a time, recording their answers. They become my individual. So we can kind of see, we start with our big population that I want to know something about or I want to ask a question about, but I can't ask everybody in that population, so I have to rely on a smaller sample. And that smaller sample is composed of individuals that are going to hopefully be well represent my population that I want to study. All right, next round of definitions. If I can collect data from the entire population, this is called a census. Now, censuses are incredibly rare. Now, the United States does a census every 10 years where they have to actually physically get data from every single person in this country. I actually worked on the 2010 U.S. Census as someone who went door to door. The people that didn't send their mailers back, I literally went to their houses, interviewed them so that we had data on everybody. And this is really, really important because this is how we determine representation in Congress. This is how budgets and how we know where to build schools, fire departments, police departments, and all of the public services that the government provides. Now, this is also very costly. It is in the magnitude of billions of dollars for the United States to conduct a census every 10 years. So it's rare. Now, next definition. A parameter describes our population. So if I do want to talk about how an entire population behaves or how an entire population, that whole group, how they feel, then I want a parameter. A statistic describes our sample, that smaller group. And so, like I said, that main concept of statistics is that I am going to have to rely on just a small sample. And so statistics is that study of, okay, well, how do I describe that small sample? And one of our main goals in the entire course of statistics, one of the things that we'll be doing by the end of learning Statistics 1, is that we want to be able to estimate what that parameter should be using that statistic. So again, my goal is to estimate how everybody feels, and I have to estimate because I can't possibly know, because I can't possibly ask everybody, and I can't possibly have everybody give me their answers. So I'm going to have to rely on that statistic. And then the part we need to remember is that if I'm doing that, there's always going to be some uncertainty baked into the fact that I'm relying on this sample. So my statistic better include a margin of error, right? How much wiggle room we think the true value might actually have. And that is based on that probability. So that's why we really need all these different parts to be able to put statistics together. And in fact, a lot of times this was called a course in probability and statistics because probability plays such a huge role in understanding how we can estimate these parameters by using a statistics. Now, a little hint or a little tip to help you remember these definitions. Parameter, population, the P's. So the P's go together. Statistic, sample, the S's go together. So the letter really helps you understand what we're talking about. So again, population is the whole, sample is the little bit, and I think that kind of makes sense intuitively. And then when we throw in how we describe those things, again, just look at the first letter. Population, parameter, sample, statistic. Now, when we're collecting this data, any data that we collect, these are our variables. And variables is a very broad term that really means any attribute that can take on different values. So again, when we talk about variables in, say, in algebra class, which is a little bit different, right? That we're trying to find out, oh, okay, what is my variable, X variable, what does X equal, those sorts of things. But again, variables is a much more broader general term. Now, we typically take these variables and break them down into two different types. The first is our quantitative or numerical variables. And so again, these are numerical values. They're numbers or measurements that can be subtracted meaningfully. Usually that's a good kind of rule of thumb to keep in your mind, right? They're only numerical if I can do math with them in some sort of meaningful way, in some sort of way that makes sense. So for example, if I knew the year that I was born and I knew the year that you were born, I could subtract those 2 years to figure out the difference in our ages. So because I can subtract that, then the year that we were born is absolutely going to be a quantitative or numerical variable. So quantitative means quantity, it means numerical. That's our first type of variable. Then our other type of variable is our qualitative or categorical variable. And these are typically attributes or characteristics or labels, and it's where arithmetic really doesn't have any particular meaning. So for example, let's say we're talking about someone's favorite color, right? I can't really subtract green and blue in a meaningful way. So that has to be a categorical type variable, right? The answers only fit into categories, or again, we call that qualitative. Now, it is really important that we kind of keep in mind that not all variables that have numbers in them are actually quantitative. So for example, phone numbers are obviously numbers, right? It's a bunch of numbers together, but if I subtracted my phone number from your phone number, that's not telling me anything meaningful. I can't subtract phone numbers and actually get something that's useful, which means even though it is a phone number, it is not going to be a numerical variable. Your phone number would be a qualitative or categorical variable. Also, sometimes depending upon the situation, so let's say that there's a contest and you can either win a $100 prize or you win nothing. Well, even though that this is numbers, 100 or 0, it might make more sense to classify this as a categorical type problem because it's either win or lose. And again, it depends upon the situation, and sometimes it's just important to really think it out and think about what would make the most sense. And that is something that you develop by doing a lot of statistics and practicing and looking at a bunch of different types of problems. But again, it's always important to keep in the back of your mind that just because we see numbers doesn't necessarily mean we are dealing with numerical variables. And usually that is the first step in almost every statistical problem, is to just understand, well, what is the variable that I am looking at? What kind of data am I collecting? Am I collecting number data, right? Where I'm looking at a bunch of numbers, or am I collecting category type answers? Now, this is important because all research is going to contain numbers. And that doesn't mean that we're studying only numerical variables. Like I said, it is crucial that you consider what is the researcher, what is the person who's asking the question, what are they writing down? Are they writing down a numerical variable, or are they writing down a categorical? And it's always the question that the researcher asks and what type of answer that they record. So if a researcher is asking a yes or no type question, well, yes or no, that's certainly not a numerical answer. That is going to be categorical. That is a qualitative data. So again, we're going to see examples where researchers surveyed 386 people and found that 105 of them watched hockey. Well, is this a numerical variable? Are we looking at numerical data? Or is this actually qualitative data? And so even though I'm looking at a bunch of numbers here, the question is, do you watch hockey? And that is a yes or no type question, which means we are collecting qualitative or categorical data. Obviously, we're summarizing that data with numbers, but just because we summarize that data with numbers does not mean that our initial data was numerical. And that can be a really difficult, kind of confusing concept at first as we first start learning statistics. Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit. because variables also come in different flavors depending upon the type of research we're doing. So if I am doing research and I want to, again, study some phenomena, the outcome of that research is my response variable. Now, sometimes that's also called the target variable. It's what we want to hopefully be able to predict. And so what is the response? Well, the response is probably going to be influenced by our explanatory variables. And our explanatory variables are the ones that help to predict or to explain that response variable. And so sometimes these are called the features of my particular, research, or the predictors of my research. And these are the variables that we use to, again, hopefully determine how we can manipulate our response. So the explanatory causes the response, except we're going to have to be really careful because we can't always claim causality when it comes to statistics, but we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But again, typically the response variable is that one variable that we are trying to isolate. We are trying to understand why that variable behaves the way it does. And our explanatory variables, and again, sometimes there's one, sometimes there's many. What are those explanatory variables? How do those influence the response, which is what I'm really trying to study? Now, the problem is that we can have this process called confounding. And confounding is when the effects of two or more of our explanatory variables can't be separated. I can't know why something happened necessarily because it could be much more complicated. And that's a very real fact. And that is something where it is very difficult and we need to try to account for a bunch of variables. But there could always be the possibility of a lurking variable hiding in my data. And a lurking variable, and I love that name, is that it's an explanatory variable. So it's something that explains my response, but it wasn't considered. So it's just kind of lurking there in the background. I didn't consider it, but unfortunately it's affecting my response variable in some way that is not necessarily captured in my study. Now, when we collect our data, we typically collect our data in two ways. The first is an observational study, and this is where researchers do not attempt to influence the study at all. All they do is just observe and then record the results. The other way we collect data is through a designed experiment. And this is where researchers deliberately impose some form of treatment. And that's the key right there. If something is being imposed, if something is being forced into the study or into the research, that is absolutely going to be a designed experiment. Now, the observational studies are actually much more common because they are cheaper than experiments and they can investigate a wide variety of questions, including sometimes illegal or unethical topics. The nice part is researchers can also use old records to perform observational studies about the past. They're not imposing any treatment, they're just asking questions. And so all poll questions are typically observational studies. They're asking, how do you feel about some particular topic? And then they're just recording the results. That's an observational study. And like I said, they are much more common, they're much more cheaper, and they are the only way that we can possibly study any unethical topic or sometimes in any illegal topic. So, for example, researchers want to study opiate addiction, right? That's a really crucial thing for us to try to understand, right? Obviously, opiate addiction is a crisis that is occurring right now in our nation. Now, we cannot do a designed experiment on opiate addiction because it would be unethical to impose that opiate use and then try to study its effects. Right? I can't force someone to use opiates. That would be unethical and it would be illegal. So I cannot design an experiment that way. However, if there is an individual that's already using opiates, researchers are perfectly allowed to observe the results. They can certainly ask the person suffering from addiction, how much have you used? When are you using? They can collect as much data as they want, but they cannot impose. They cannot force anyone to use the opiates. And so again, any illegal or unethical topic, unfortunately, we're going to have to use observational studies. This has also become a real issue because when it comes to things like marijuana legalization or for treating things like epilepsy, well, since marijuana is illegal from a federal standpoint, it is almost impossible to design a study to study it. Similar to, there's talk of using psychedelics to treat depression, but again, these things are illegal, so we can't design an experiment around it. All we can do is observe people who maybe are already using these things. Now, a designed experiment, on the other hand, like I said, these are where we impose conditions, and that means they are typically much more costly, and they are always going to require a control group, which is used to determine our baseline response. So the control group, this is the group that are not given any sort of treatment. They have to serve as that baseline. So if I do want to test, let's say, if an allergy medicine works, which is perfectly legal, I will need to have a group that takes the allergy medicine and a group that does not, and compare the results between those two groups. So again, that group that does not get it, that is my control group. Now, sometimes, instead of just not being given the medicine, they are given a placebo. And a placebo is a treatment that has no active ingredient, but the participants think they are getting the active ingredient. That way they don't know that they're members of the control group. And this is really important too, because the placebo effect is a very real thing that has been documented through a ton of scientific literature, where if a person thinks they're getting medicine, in some cases, their body responds like they actually got that medicine. Just because they think that they got that treatment, their body actually reacts as if they had gotten that treatment, and the placebo works just as well as the regular medicine. So then the question becomes, is that regular medicine working? And how would I test that? And that's one of those questions that we are going to need inferential statistics to study and to solve, but we're not quite there yet. Now, another thing with designed experiments, like I said, they have to be ethical. That is very, very important, which means that any designed experiment must be reviewed in advance by an institutional review board. And the institutional review board, they are charged with protecting the safety and the well-being of all subjects participating in any sort of research. Now, this means that all subjects in an experiment must give their informed consent, meaning that they have got to be informed of exactly what the study is about and what any risks might be, and then they have to consent. They have to say that they are okay to be part of it, and then it has to be recorded. And then that individual data must also be kept confidential. If you participate in research or a study, all of your personal information must be kept confidential as well. That is an important part of doing research. Now, the levels of, are we doing a single blind study or is it a double blind study? And double blind means that the researcher doesn't even know who's in the control group and who's not in the control group. They have to run the experiment normally so that they treat everybody the same, and then it's at the end where they compare the results, right? So the participants are blind because they don't know if they are part of the control group or the group receiving treatment. And it is double blind because the researcher doesn't even know who belongs to which group. That information is kept separate. Now, what is really, really, really important is that even though observational studies are much cheaper, they are much more common and they are incredibly useful because we can study much more difficult subjects. We can even go back in the past and we can make observations about what life was like, let's say back in the 1800s. Well, everybody's dead who was born in the 1800s now. So, okay, I can still study it because somebody recorded that data. But even though observational studies have all these great aspects to them, we need to be very, very, very careful because observational studies can never, ever allow a researcher to claim causation. They can never claim that one thing causes another through an observational study. The only thing they can claim is that there is a correlation or a link between these variables. So again, these variables might be related in some way, but we cannot claim which one causes the other one. We cannot claim a cause and effect through an observational study alone. Now, again, we can show that relationships exist through observational studies. We can see that two variables somehow behave in a way where one seems to affect the other, but I cannot know the direction of that relationship. Now, for example, back in mid-2023, Harvard published a study saying that there is a link between eating ultra-processed food and depression. Now, does that mean that eating processed food will make you depressed? Well, we don't know. Again, it was an observational study because maybe eating processed food will make you depressed. Or maybe if you're depressed, you're not going to want to cook a meal, so you're going to have to rely on processed food. So wait, which direction does it go? Is eating processed food making you depressed? Or is it your depression that's making you eat processed food? Or could it be a third thing? Because they also showed in that study that the processed food and the depression were also linked to alcohol use. So is drinking alcohol the reason that you're too lazy to cook, so you eat processed food, and then alcohol is a depressant, so is that why you're depressed? Or again, are you depressed so you're drinking alcohol and the alcohol leads to... Again, that is where we get very confused, and unfortunately, our current media does a terrible job of making sure that this idea is well known. They claim that there's links, and it always feels like there is a bias towards causation, that one thing causes another. Processed food causes depression, but that's not the case. We can never, ever, through an observational study, claim causation. And again, hopefully we kind of understand why that is now, right? Well, which direction does it go? I don't know. We would have to do a designed experiment, which would be very confusing, costly, and difficult to show whether one necessarily causes the other. All we can state for sure right now is that they are somehow linked to each other. Okay, now let's see if we can take what we have learned so far in this video and actually apply it to a couple scenarios. So I'm going to give us 4 examples, and in each of these examples, I want you to determine whether the research is, first of all, an observational study or a designed experiment, right? Then the next question, in each research scenario, what is going to be our response variable, right? What are we trying to measure? And then whether is that response variable going to be a numerical or quantitative variable or a categorical or qualitative variable? Which one is it going to be? And then similarly, what is my explanatory variable? And is that explanatory variable numerical or categorical? So let's jump right in. So our first example, a researcher sits at a stoplight and they record the color of every car that runs the red light. Now, are they doing an observational study or a designed experiment? Now, what you should do is pause this video right now. Pause this video, write down your answers, and then check it with mine. That's how learning works, is that you guess things, and then hopefully someone of authority, like a teacher or a professor, will point out where you made your mistakes. They will explain why you made that mistake, and then you learn from that, and so you don't make that mistake in the future. If you literally just, have someone tell you the answers, you're not learning, and you're not going to do real well. So take the time, pause real quick, answer these questions, and then 3, 2, 1, I'm going to answer them. So he sits at a stoplight and records. The question with observational study or designed experiment, are we imposing treatment? And in this case, no, we're just recording what happens. So this is absolutely going to be an observational study. Now the next part, the response variable and the explanatory variable. This could be a little bit more complicated here. So the response that this researcher is probably looking at is whether or not that car actually runs a red light. And if you run a red light, that is a categorical question, right? Either you ran it or you did not. And then the explanatory variable is, well, does the color of the car have any effect on whether or not you're going to run a red light? And then the color of your car would also be a categorical variable. So in this case, we're looking at 2 categorical variables. And does the color of your car affect whether or not you are more likely to run a red light or not? And again, all those variables are categorical in nature. All right, example 2. A botanist wants to know if used coffee grounds will make tomato plants grow taller. So he harvests seeds, he splits them into 2 groups with the same soil and in the same type of container. However, one container gets coffee grounds and then the other does not. The botanist then measures the height of each plant as they grow. All right, same thing. pause the video, come up with your answers, and I will start going over the answers in 3, 2, 1. So is this an observational study or a designed experiment? Well, again, the question is, have we imposed some sort of treatment? And in this case, well, we have. We have put coffee grounds in one of the containers. So I have imposed treatment, and I've also kept a control group. There is one container that does not get the coffee grounds. So I'm absolutely doing a designed experiment. We are imposing treatment, and we even have a control group. Now, what is my response variable? What am I trying to determine? What is my goal here? Well, the goal here is I want to know, will coffee grounds affect the height of the plant? So my response variable, what I'm looking for a response in, is the height of my plant. Now, when I measure the height of my plant, am I measuring that as a categorical variable, or is that a numerical variable where I can add and subtract in a meaningful way? Well, numerical. The height of a plant is going to be numerical. Again, I'm measuring that in inches or centimeters or whatever units you want. Doesn't really matter. I can always subtract inches or centimeters and get a reasonable result out, right? If I subtract the heights of the coffee grounds and the heights of the not the coffee grounds, I can make sense of that information. Then my explanatory variable, the thing that we're hoping affects the height of the plant, is whether or not we had coffee grounds. And the coffee grounds would be a categorical variable. Either we had them or we didn't. It's, in this case, it's kind of a binary option. And so, yeah, that's yes or no. There's no, in this case, there's no measurement beyond the yes or the no. All right, third example. Researchers asked 1,050 participants over 10 years how much sunscreen that they used, and then they asked if the participants developed skin cancer during their study. The researchers found that the more sunscreen a person used, the more likely they were to develop skin cancer. Now, are they doing an observational study or a designed experiment? Again, take a second to pause and think. And in 3, 2, 1, this is an observational study. The scientists did not require or impose how much sunscreen a person used. They did not impose that at all. They said just record how much you're actually using, and then we'll use that data later. So this is an observational study. They're just collecting data about what people are already doing. They're trying to observe what behavior people are already exhibiting. So what is our response variable? What are they trying to be able to predict? Well, in this case, they want to predict whether or not a person gets skin cancer. Now, so skin cancer is going to be my response variable. Now, is that numerical or is that going to be categorical? Well, that's going to be categorical, right? Either you have it or you don't. So in this case, my response variable is categorical. My explanatory variable, what is going to explain whether or not we get skin cancer? In this case, in this particular study, it was the sunscreen usage. And how much sunscreen do you use? How often do you use it? And this would actually be a numerical variable. They want to measure exactly how often you use that sunscreen. So now we have a response variable that's categorical, yes or no, and my explanatory variable is numerical. And we can see that that's actually swapped or flipped from that previous example. And again, this is why doing these first steps and being able to understand what the study is telling us is really, really important, because the way we analyze data is going to depend upon the variables in our problem. And so being able to identify and classify our variables first is going to be a very important first step. Now, for this question, bonus question. Can the researchers claim that sunscreen causes cancer? Again, we see that in the study, the researchers found that the more sunscreen a person used, the more likely they were to develop skin cancer. So, does sunscreen cause skin cancer? Again, pause, think about it for a second. And now we come back and hopefully the answer in 3, 2, 1 is that no. Because it is an observational study. They did not impose this treatment, which means there could be possible confounding variables that the researcher did not consider. So this is actually a fairly, a somewhat well-known study. I guess a while ago, this was done several years ago, and it really did show that the more sunscreen that a person used, the more likely they were to develop skin cancer. this does not mean sunscreen causes skin cancer, because a researcher went back and said, wait a second, we need to look at this a little bit more deeply. It wouldn't make sense that using sunscreen causes skin cancer. There's something else that we did not consider in the initial study. And there absolutely was. So again, take a second, pause, think about what confounding variable or lurking variable exists that we didn't consider that might affect both of these at the same time. So what might affect both using sunscreen and getting skin cancer? What's some third variable that affects the first two? Again, I'll give you a second to think about it. 3, 2, 1. Again, you could hopefully come up with even maybe more than one answer, or you have a different answer than me, but it turns out it's the amount of time you spend outside. If you spend a lot of time outside, you're going to wear sunscreen more often. And also, if you spend more time outside, you're just going to be more likely to develop skin cancer, right? Someone who never leaves, the inside, all right, or lives their life in a basement, never uses sunscreen and will never get skin cancer. So again, there's that third variable of the time you spent outside that actually affects both of those at the same time. Last example. Scientists have discovered a link between vitamin B deficiency and heart disease. So again, this is a link that was found. So they get 600 participants and they separate them into 3 groups. So one group takes a specific B vitamin dose of 10 milligrams daily. One group takes a multivitamin dose of 15 milligrams daily, and the other group is told not to take any vitamins at all. So, is this an observational study or design experiment? What is the response? What is the explanatory? Again, pause the video, give yourself a chance to actually think about this and write it down before you continue so that you can hopefully improve yourself. And I'll talk about the answers in 3, 2, 1. And this is a designed experiment. They are imposing conditions. They are telling you exactly how much vitamin B you are supposed to be taking. They have designed this experiment specifically. And again, we have a control group that is told not to take any vitamins at all. So what is my response variable here? Well, my response variable is the heart disease. They want to determine whether or not you're going to develop heart disease. And what kind of variable would this be? Well, most likely this is going to be a categorical type variable. Do you have heart disease or not? It is a yes or no question. And so my response variable is heart disease. And so my explanatory variable is then going to be how much vitamin B. And in this case, I think it makes much more sense to consider this as a numerical variable because we have 10 milligrams, 15 milligrams, and 0. You could make an argument that it is also categorical because, again, it's either 10, 15, or none. We could kind of put those into categories. So, again, there's always that little bit of, like I said, art to it, right? How do we interpret what we're doing? But I think in this case, it makes the most sense to consider the vitamin B dosage as a numerical variable. Bonus question time. After 5 years of the study, there was no difference in the heart disease between the 3 groups. So, again, scientists used an observational study. They discovered a link between vitamin B and heart disease. So they did an observational study and they showed that there was that link. And again, a lot of times that is the first step. We look for something that is unusual and then we design an experiment to test our hypothesis. And that's statistics. That is absolutely 100% statistics. That is the science of statistics. We observe something and then we design an experiment so that we can test. So this is a real case here. We know for a fact there is a link between vitamin B deficiency and your likelihood of developing heart disease. The FDA ran a real study just like this, although it didn't even go 5 years because there was no difference between the groups. Why was there no difference between these groups? We know vitamin D is linked to heart disease, but when we gave people different doses of vitamin D, it didn't affect their probability of getting heart disease. So why not? Well, kind of a trick question. We still don't know. We have no idea why. Scientists are still studying it. Like a decade later, they're trying to figure out how to prevent heart disease, right? Heart disease is one of the #1 killers in America. It is one of the most dangerous conditions for Americans and their mortality. So why is there no difference? We don't know. We have no idea. And part of that is probably because the human body is insanely complex, right? We have a nervous system. We have a digestive system. We have our circulatory system. We have all of these different organs working together, and they're all influencing each other in different ways. And there are so many variables when it comes to your health and the way your body reacts that even though we know vitamin B and heart disease are certainly linked in some way, we have no idea how, and we don't know what that relationship is. And you could study it, and if you find out what that link is, you will become hopefully rich and famous. I hope. I don't know. I don't know if scientists actually become rich without, like selling out. I don't know. But you could probably become famous at least. And again, it's something that we still currently study. So again, just because we have a link between two things does not mean we have any concept of why they are linked. Although we do research, we do science, we follow the scientific method, we test our hypotheses, and hopefully we make progress as a species towards making life better for all of us. And man, shouldn't that just be the meaning of life right there? All right. Anyway, in conclusion, we talked about a few different things here. So can you answer these following questions? Number 1, what is the difference between an observational study and a designed experiment? You should be able to answer that. Number 2, you should also be able to answer what is the difference between a quantitative variable and a qualitative variable. Number 3, can you describe what a response variable is, an explanatory variable, a confounding variable, and a lurking variable are? Do we know what all those are and how we define those? And then, what are the differences between a population and a sample? And then the differences between a parameter and a statistic. Those are all things we should be able to answer now at this point. And so take a second, make sure you can answer these and understand them. And yeah, that is basics of how we collect data and how we describe our variables in statistics. So hopefully we learned something. We're going to continue to learn things because there's so much more to learn. And there's so many interesting things that we still have yet to talk about. So until then, take care of yourselves.